If there was one thing that Mandy hated more than anything else, it would be having her candy shop, her kingdom, disturbed and trashed. Her meticulous cleaning and preparing for business was undone by a single mischievous, destructive, and so annoying man. And there, right in front of her eyes, her worst nightmare was unfolding on that day of all days. Fridays were her best business days, and almost as soon as she had opened, none other than Chester had arrived to annihilate all of her hard work. He was jumping around, knocking over displays, spilling candy everywhere, and most infuriating of all, throwing confetti all over. Mandy was furious. "Chester, you rapscallion, get over here," she yelled, running after the rambunctious jester. Chester, fond of dressing like a harlequin, was not a great entertainer for the queenly Mandy. He fit better in the role of menace, disturbing the peace and terrorizing people whenever possible, mostly within Mandy's candy shop. She could never understand where he got off doing it, if not just to torment specifically her. "Oh, don't get your knickers in a twist, madam," he said, continuing to be just as big of a nuisance. Mandy despised it when he called her madam. "Turn down your hot air, you big balloon." Mandy was red in the face, her eyes shooting daggers and her cheeks puffed up, ironically, looking like a balloon. She continued to chase after the agile little bastard, who seemed particularly fit to avoid her every attempt to apprehend him. While he dodged and bounced this way and that, Chester had a sudden idea. Actually, maybe she needs a little more hot air. He directed his path of destruction toward the front desk of the shop, eventually hopping over the counter to find himself behind the cash register. Mandy followed, entering the small space behind the counter with him. "Huh, got you, you little annoyance dash." Mandy thought for a moment that she'd gotten the upper hand before her sentence was cut off. With a devious grin still plastered on his mug, Chester flipped into the air like an acrobat and landed right atop Mandy's face. But first, MMFPH. With a muffled grunt, Mandy's face was smothered by the jester's large and surprisingly plush ass. The force of the sudden landing knocked Mandy to her knees. Chester reached down and grabbed her arms, and in just 2 moves, Chester had a significant upper hand on the queen of the candy store. Her crown was knocked from her head, both figuratively and literally, with her small faux gold tiara clattering onto the floor. "I'm surprised I never thought to do this before, especially considering how many times I've called you buttface," Chester remarked, pulling Mandy hard against his booty with a tug. Mandy protested, but all of her words were silenced by the thick layer of cloth and ass fat rubbing against her. Try and she might, the clownish fellow was just too strong. Chester took great pleasure in grinding his butt against Mandy's smug face. With how much she'd always thwart his plans to terrorize her customers, he took great satisfaction in finally, personally giving her what she deserved, an ass to the face. He leaned up against the counter and pulled Mandy along with him, forcing her to continue to breathe exclusively through the fabric of his baggy one-piece costume and his butt. It was then that Mandy realized just how much this conniving clown's butt stunk. The last thing on her mind, when she thought of Chester, was his butt, but not only was his backside bigger and more of a perfect, round pair of bubble cheeks, but it smelled downright rank. What an outrage, a mere jester having a more impressive ass than a queen. Needless to say, Mandy wasn't in the best position to be angry about the size of her rear in comparison to the one that was currently smothering her. With her eyes just barely able to see over his butt cheeks, she caught a glimpse of Chester, who was looking back at her just grinning as he continued to pull her forward into his booty. Her nose and mouth were simply buried in his crack, making every breath she took be tainted by the scent of his ass. Then, Chester let go of Mandy's arms. She fell backward against the wall, finally able to breathe fresh air. Needing to catch her breath forced her to watch as Chester reached into his hat and pulled out what looked like a jelly bean. He popped the piece of candy into his mouth, eating it before peering back at Mandy, his imposing butt cheeks still facing her. "I figure that this is somewhat of a once-in-a-lifetime experience, so hey, why not give you a little bit of my own hot air?" Confused by his statement, Mandy only had time to gasp and look wide-eyed as Chester leaned backward, his butt plummeting toward her until it landed on her face once more. This time, not only was she trapped against the wall behind her, but his large ass managed to cover her entire face, leaving her seeing nothing but darkness and smelling nothing but his ass. Though, If she had known what was coming, she may have yearned to smell only his ass. Struggle as she might, Mandy was solidly trapped under his rear end, no matter how hard she pushed or struggled. Then, as she heard a guttural gurgling coming from within Chester's ass, she stopped still, almost in disbelief. No way, he wouldn't dare, she thought. Of course, he would dare. BBFBFRRRRRTT. A fart of a special foulness blew from Chester's butt directly into Mandy's face. She screamed a muffled scream beneath him as some of the gas leaked into her mouth and nose, leaving her no choice but to breathe in the pure stink right from his smelly ass. All Chester could do was laugh. "Oh, you're in for a lot more hot air, you windbag." Well, I guess I'd be the windbag in this case, huh? Chester laughed out loud at his own joke before reaching into an unseen pocket and pulling out a long string of tied-together scarves. It made the perfect harness as he tied it around his waist and the back of Mandy's head in a tight knot. Now truly trapped against the repugnant boy's booty, he could move freely while keeping his fart cushion squarely against his plush cheeks. Truly, he was an inventor on the fly. The jelly bean he'd eaten had seriously turned his guts into high gear, working his gassy insides into a frenzy. All of the growls and gurgles coming from inside him made Mandy almost nervous, as more farts blasting into her face was inevitable. She braced herself for more stink as an especially loud gurgle emanated from within him. Blairerpterpt, fulflororert, brayapt. A true torrent of funky stench was pushed out from the deepest parts of Chester's bowels. No matter how hard she kept her mouth shut, she couldn't keep the gas from infiltrating her senses through her nose. She had to gasp and groan, making some of the farts seep into his mouth. Being made to taste his foul gas was the most disgusting thing she'd ever had to endure. Meanwhile, Chester was acting outwardly casual. Almost tauntingly, he made little expression as each blast of booty stink was released into the poor girl. As he leaned against the front counter, he heard the doorbell at the front of the shop ring and noticed that a customer had walked in. He grinned and lowered his ass slightly, keeping his fart cushion out of view. Mandy had heard the bell as well and began to yell and struggle against Chester's fat ass. Rap rap. A sudden fart dazed her and made her fall silent. Chester watched with a smirk as the unsuspecting customer browsed the store, completely oblivious to the fact that the jester had Mandy trapped against his gassy rear. Even his farts, which he of course made no effort to hide, were filtered by his personal cushion, sounding only like low rumblings. He looked innocent enough as the person approached the register, and even as he happily rang up the fellow, he pushed out an especially long and stinky fart right into Mandy's mouth. The guy didn't suspect a thing, and took his candy and left, at least, before peering around the dirty, jester-defiled shop one more time. As the shop once again stood empty, Chester couldn't stop himself from giggling madly. What a treat to be able to torture his stuck-up nemesis with his gassy ass without anyone knowing. He gave his booty a smack before letting loose another stinky gas blast. Taking in the exciting nature of his ploy, though, he noticed that Mandy had gone still. Despite him taking such joy in the activity, he hoped he hadn't done in the snotty girl. Effortlessly undoing his makeshift harness, Mandy fell away from Chester's plush booty and slumped onto the ground. Upon seeing her face, Chester simply smirked and chuckled to himself. She wasn't dead, of course, just passed out, her eyes shut softly. Her mouth hung open and her face remained blushing and red, probably half from embarrassment and half from having a butt smushed against her. Good thing too, as Chester felt just about emptied of farts. Although what a shame about that. One of Chester's favorite things was farting, and now he'd used up all of his gas on this one folly. If only there were a way for him to replenish his supply. At that, he peered down at the unconscious queen of the candy store, another devious idea coming to him as he zipped down his costume. Mandy regained consciousness after only a few moments, blinking her eyes before wincing and coughing. The taste of Chester's rancid stench still stained her mouth and nose, which made her want to gargle soap. As her senses rebooted and woke up, she realized that something was happening down at her feet. Upon looking, she gasped with pure disgust. Chester was squatting in front of her, only now his bare, pale ass cheeks were exposed. He'd slipped his costume right off, save for his ridiculous hat. That wasn't the worst part, however, as she could see him grabbing her feet before forcing them into his bubble butt. She could feel his butthole pressing against her toes. Even worse when it relaxed and let them slip inside. Eewee wow. She grimaced as she reacted to the sensation. Having her feet inserted into this foul boy's ass was not on her bucket list, or any list for that matter. She shuddered as his warm, slimy insides pulsated and squeezed around her feet. With his hands still wrapped around her ankles, Chester pulled her towards his ass again, letting her heel slip right past his anus and into his bowels. Chester, what on earth do you think you're doing? Mandy tried to pull herself away from Chester's ass, which had started clenching and bouncing rhythmically, pulling her deeper inside with each contraction. Those huge, wobbly bubbles were eating her alive. Well, I used up all my farts just for you, so I thought I could give you a reward for being such a trooper. Chester gave an excuse that Mandy didn't believe for a second. Now you get to help me by filling up my gas tank, personally. He punctuated his statement with a deliberate tug of his colon, slurping Mandy up a good few inches. His butt was really eating her. Those round ass cheeks were going to gobble her up like she was just some piece of meat. Mandy felt a lot of things, offended, disgusted, and flabbergasted among them. But what she felt more than anything was arousal, and she hated it. How dare she be brought to this level, made to bow down and submit to this knave. Granted, his behind was downright splendid, but she didn't want to be inside it. Despite her attempts to pull herself away from Chester's hungry booty, she was also too curious of what it would be like inside of his rank, disgusting, foul intestines. Feflor. Chester pushed a fart out of his, but while it was sucking down Mandy, the gas exited his hole as it wrapped around Mandy's hips. Mandy made a cute sort of moan, which Chester found downright adorable. If only that wasn't the last of his gas, he'd love to smother her silly with his farts while she was like this. Instead, he resumed his clenching, working his ass muscles nicely. Chester's butthole pressed against Mandy's waist, having slipped past her hips already. Her poofy outfit was pushed up against her stomach as Chester's ass kept on stuffing her in. Mandy was breathing quite heavily by that point, and her cheeks were a brighter shade of red. Chester huge, but was holding her up now, and she was close enough that she could put her hands on those plush mounds of fat. She would have used the opportunity to try and push her way out of his vacuous rear. Only his butt was so warm and soft, softer than any pillow she had. No matter how much she squeezed, it just felt like his butt cheeks were nothing but pillowy padding, like marshmallows. Meanwhile, Chester found Mandy's sudden infatuation with his ass laughable. Although, deep down, it did touch him a little bit. He might consider not sucking the poor girl into his hole to replenish his stinky farts, nah. The jester's butthole suckled around Mandy's chest. The supple ring of his anus squeezed her bust tightly, which only made her blush harder. She stifled her moans, still fighting with her indignation at being devoured by her worst enemy. After another clench, her chest was sucked in too, pushing her arms above her head. She could see the juicy, twitching anus near her chin as she looked down, surrounded on both sides by Chester's mountainous, fat booty cheeks. A rank, sort of musky scent emanated from the space inside of his hole, and stench she'd be getting used to very soon. Chester looked back at his prey and callously waved goodbye before clenching hard. Mandy made a cute EP sound before her head disappeared inside of Chester's colon. Nothing but her arms were left outside of his bubble butt. Having most of his meal stuffing his gut, he sported quite the belly by that point. He rubbed his hand gently along his round tummy, feeling the subtle bulges within as Mandy curled up in his guts. Still squatting, he bounced his butt up and down some more. His clapping cheeks slurped up Mandy's arms like spaghetti. He made sure to stop twerking just as her hands were left outside of his butthole. He stood up and admired how full he looked. What a great meal that drama queen made. And she even enjoyed being eaten in the end. She wasn't struggling too much in his bowels, though she was surely getting used to his guts' climate. He peered back at his cheeks and giggled at the sight of Mandy's fingertips barely poking out from his deep butt crack. Chester reached for his outfit and pulled it on. He shivered with delight as pulling the suit over his ass made Mandy's fingers finally slip inside of his huge ass. He could have sworn he even heard his butt make a slurping sound. Then he had his big gut to deal with. Grabbing the zipper below and the suit above, he began to zip up the suit around his belly. His tum wanted to sag down so badly, but his suit demanded. It compressed to fit. Every bit he managed to pull the zipper up, Mandy felt her surroundings squeeze tighter and tighter. The colon walls compressed her down until she felt like a little ball, at which point Chester finally managed to zip his costume all the way up. Then, she felt herself slid down. Chester managed to tug his zipper up fully, but as his stomach was squeezed tight by the constricting fabric, he felt something part his ass cheeks and slip out of his rectum. He blushed at first, but then took on his usual mischievous expression. Peering back, he was delighted to see a bulge in the back of his costume, between the two round orbs of his booty cheeks. He could make out the imprint of his Meal's face, though not her expression. No doubt it was one of terror, even though she wasn't screaming much. Not wanting to give his butt snack any time outside her new home, he squeezed his butt cheeks together. The muscles of his ass slurped around Mandy's head and made it disappear right back inside his tight bowels. Chester let out his breath and gave his swollen tummy a pat. It was only about the size of a basketball, making it hard for him to even believe that Mandy was still in there. Nevertheless, he leaned against the front counter of the store and basked in the feeling of a full belly. The smug jester would lounge in the store the rest of the day. Not many customers came in, and the ones who didn't notice his swollen stomach. Hours passed, and bit by bit his gut shrank, then dwindled into nothing, returning to its usual flatness. Chester flipped the sign in the front window of the candy shop to closed, sighing after having milled around doing little jesting save for earlier. His hand slipped over his flat stomach, and he felt a smirk come on as he realized Mandy was fully processed. Though, digesting a girl like her wouldn't have just given him a heaping helping of gas. He sauntered over to a nearby mirror and ogled his new physique. As expected, his ass was just a little bit bigger and had an extra layer of jiggly pudge. He rubbed his hands along it and giggled. Later, after Chester left for home, the jester was getting ready for bed. He stood with nothing on but a towel, his hair still a little wet after taking a shower. He stood in front of the mirror, drying himself off, when something caught his eye. He looked closer at himself in the mirror, turning his ass to face it. Plastered on his right ass cheeks was what appeared to be a tattoo of Mandy's face. She had on a delirious, lustful expression. He pressed his fingers against it, making sure it was real. He was fascinated at the sudden change. After all, he'd never stuffed anyone up his ass and digested them before. However, after the amazement wore off, he was incredibly amused. He grinned widely and giggled like a madman. Mandy really had made her new home on his cheeks. Chester was ecstatic. Of course, he'd planned on bringing her back eventually, but knowing that she was right there made that time seem much farther off than before.